Well, hello out there, everybody. Uh, Welcome to another round of I Definitely Know What I'm Doing. And you may notice that Crake and Bake is taking a break this episode. So Pipsqueak here, taking care of your Minecrafty needs for the day. Crake and Bake agreed to swap places with me, so he'll just be taking the back seat, and I'll be running the show for the day. So welcome. Glad to have you along. And definitely, this has nothing to do with the day of the year that it is. Nope, definitely not. Nothing at all like that. So you'll notice here I am down in the diamond mine. I suppose it doesn't necessarily look too familiar to everybody since last time we did a diamond hunt, it was mostly off stream. But that's what this nice deep dark corridors are. Is our lovely diamond mine. And that's because today I am needing some diamonds. And, well, frankly, that's not necessarily the most visually exciting thing to be watching, and, I didn't want to push off getting diamonds any longer. So I figured, while getting some diamonds, I can tell you a story. I hope you like it. It's one that I haven't really practiced saying in a while, so I hope I remember all the parts. But yeah, figured I'll get rolling on that. I suppose then, without further ado, I might as well grab my things. And I do have some chests here for all of the diamonds we're going to be getting. Hopefully these will both be filled up. I don't actually expect that. But then I've got other supplies, so we should be well equipped for taking care of stuff. And otherwise, I hate to cover up my lovely face, but we'll you never know what you might run into down in the mines, so good to always be equipped. And otherwise, I will just head off into one of the tunnels. These are old tunnels we've had, but here's our fresh tunnels all ready to go for today. And yeah, hope you enjoy the story while we're going. All right. So to start things off, it was the second day since Bill had crashed his Jeep. He had been out doing donuts in the dunes in the desert. Had decided to go off-road for a while and started spinning some circles out in the dunes. And it was a lot of excitement and fun for him. But unfortunately, he had indeed crashed his Jeep, went over a dune that was a little bit too high. And he wasn't quite expecting what was going to happen. So the Jeep crashed. And so it was, that was 2 days ago now. He had spent the first day just kind of sitting still and, waiting things out. He didn't think he had gone too far off the road. So he thought he would be just fine. Someone would come out, find his tracks out, and come and rescue him. Now, he had not very much for supplies along with, just a little bit of water and a little bit of snacks. He'd only planned on being out whipping donuts for a couple of hours, jumping the dunes, so he really hadn't brought a lot with, and he had just stopped at a gas station. So his plan was, go out from the gas station and then have some fun out in the sand and head back to the gas station, and he'd have all the supplies he needed. Unfortunately, since he did get into a crash and didn't really have anything extra, that was starting to bite him in the butt. So he had tried, conserving some water and his snacks and things. He knew, well, he did have the nice shelter of his Jeep, that he was expecting a rescue pretty soon. He knew that it was still a good idea to go through his supplies slowly, just because he didn't know how long it would take. So he rationed out his water and his food, and by the time the first night rolled around, he was getting a little bit nervous. He did have the shelter of his vehicle, and he tried keeping the headlights on for portions of the night, just so that anyone who might come out looking for him would be able to find him easier. But lo and behold, the first night passed, and nobody came to rescue him. So he wasn't too nervous for the second day. you know, it hadn't been that long. He had been careful to ration things out. But sure enough, the whole day ended up going and passing, and still nobody came out to find him. And by the end of the second day there, the second daytime day, he did finish off his limited water supplies. So he knew he was kind of in a pickle. So the evening was rolling along, and he knew he was going to have to make some decisions come the next time the sun came up, realizing that it was very likely that somebody maybe just wasn't coming out to get him, and he was going to have to head back. He had tried a few times to get his car rewrited, and, you know, he didn't know much about vehicles, so in general, he was unsure if there was something wrong with the car itself at this point anyways. It just didn't seem to really be turning over. So he knew he was kind of in a predicament here. Now he did then decide, you know, he would spend the one more night because he didn't want to be stumbling around out in the dark. But come the next sunrise, that he would have to start venturing out. And trying... Ooh, diamonds. So fast. Nice. So he knew he would have to start venturing out pretty soon here. So he went ahead and, you know, prepared the best that he could. You know, waited out that one last night. He figured to... you know, there had been some winds out in the desert lately, so he figured that he probably, any tire tracks that he maybe had left, had gotten maybe blown away in the wind. So that's probably part of why there was no real rescue party coming. Now, like I'd mentioned, he had gone through his food and snacks, or his food and water. And he wasn't too terribly concerned about the food. By all means, he was hungry. But he had been a Boy Scout back in the day, a long time ago. And he knew that the body could survive quite a long time without food. If he remembered correctly from his time in the Scouts, that there was the rule of 3. So you could survive 3 weeks without food, and 3 minutes without air, but you could only survive 3 days without water. And here it had been, the next day would be his first day without water, and he didn't know too, since he had been only having sparing amounts of water, he'd really only had one big bottle of water along with, that probably extended the 3 days out a little bit, but not by a whole lot, since he had that kind of partial day there. Plus, he didn't know, you know, how long he would be able to keep trekking with so little food and water in his system, since he knew he had to keep energy going. So the sun came up, and he knew he had to set off, and he also, from his time in the Boy Scouts, thought he could remember, you know, how to navigate based on the sunrise and sunset. He was pretty sure what he remembered was that the sun rose in the west, because it went west to east, spelling out we. He was pretty sure that's how it worked. So he paid attention to the sun coming up, and he was pretty sure that he had crashed somewhere off to the west of the gas station. So he figured whichever direction the sun came up in was the direction he was going to want to head in to get back to it. He didn't know exactly if he was straight out, but he figured he'd at least be able to come across the road. Now he knew, too, that it was going to be very difficult to cross the desert without any water or food. Again, the food he wasn't terribly concerned about, but especially the water. You know, when the sun was up, it could be obviously very difficult to keep going for a long time out in the desert. And he wasn't sure how much that changed the rule of 3. So he did do a double search of his Jeep before he set off, making sure that there wasn't any water along with. And he couldn't find anything that really was water, but he did have a bottle of windshield wiper fluid. And he didn't know how well that could work for him. Since it was liquid, he knew it wasn't meant to be drank. And he knew that they put something in it to try and keep people from drinking it. But he was pretty sure it was just, something to kind of give it a bad taste, maybe make you throw up if you drank a lot, because he knew that some people used to drink windshield wiper fluid, but he couldn't remember all the details there. So he figured that as long as he, tried not to drink it and only drank a little tiny bit of it, that'd probably be fine. So he filled up his small water bottle with some windshield wiper fluid. He decided not to bring the whole jug of fluid since he figured the extra weight wouldn't be very, very helpful. And he wanted to minimize, how much extra strain and stress he had while going out in the desert. And since he really hadn't brought anything else with him, he didn't have any other supplies that he brought along with, so he had a pretty light load to go out, just himself and the bottle of wiper fluid, and so he set off. He headed out again towards where the sun had been rising, assuming that was off to the west where the gas station had been, and so he kept heading out. And as he kept going, some of the surroundings looked maybe kind of familiar, but with some desert areas it can be so hard to tell, especially when the winds are blowing with the sand dunes. The landscape can really shift so much. So he really wasn't positive if he was just telling himself that everything was starting to look familiar, or if it actually was. But he liked to be hopeful, and just kind of assumed he was going in the right direction. Now he kind of continued on with that. As the day kept going, it obviously got hotter and hotter. When he could, he tried to find places of shade to rest in, maybe on one side of a sand dune or something like that, if he ever kind of came across an outcropping. But there really wasn't much for shade for him to work with. And he had that, that bottle of the windshield wiper fluid, and, it kept getting more tempting and more tempting. It sat there, and he, was getting quite thirsty by this point, since he had been traveling for several hours, but he really wanted to try and not drink it at all if he could help it. He was pretty sure he'd be able to get back to the gas station in not very long. So he kept trekking along, and the sun kind of just kept beating down hotter and hotter, and it was really starting to wear down on him, and he knew that he really couldn't last very long. Really probably the one day was about all the energy he'd have. He could tell already how much the sun was draining on him, and he really knew the gravity of the situation he was in, considering again that rule of three, only 3 days without water, and especially exerting himself out in the desert. He knew that he was going to be getting more dehydrated faster. So Bill kept going along, and it was probably about the mid-afternoon by this point. The sun had been beating down on him, and he just knew that he needed a drink. He knew it wasn't a great idea to go for the windshield wiper fluid, but he still hadn't found the gas station yet. He was still working, and just knew that he needed something. So he figured a little bit probably would be just fine. Which again, he remembered that he knew they put something in there to try and keep people from drinking it. And he thought that it made you throw up, so he wanted to kind of test it out before he really drank too much, especially because he knew too that throwing up can make you dehydrate out faster. So kind of for his first sip, he just kind of took a little bit in his mouth of the windshield wiper fluid, just kind of swished it around, really tried not to really drink it down, but just kind of let it sit in his mouth and kind of cool things off. It did taste funny. He didn't care for the taste, but he knew he needed some amount of liquid, so he tried to make it last as long as he could, holding it in his mouth and then just kind of slowly swallowing little sipfuls down, and he only did the one mouthful. He didn't want to overdo it and, you know, risk making himself too sick, and kind of told himself, you know, as long as that lasted, as long as that sat, he could probably handle drinking a little bit more as long as it didn't make him throw up. Which, you know, it was really hard to tell time out in the desert there. The sun was definitely on its way down again, which he was pretty sure then must have been the east. So that kind of helped too, of he could follow his shadow to keep going in that straight line out to the west. He hadn't thrown up yet from the windshield wiper fluid. He didn't necessarily feel rehydrated, but he knew that it really wasn't like water. It wasn't super refreshing. So he wasn't expecting to feel, you know, a lot better. And he was feeling a lot better with the sun going down. You know, the air was starting to cool off a little bit. But he was starting to get worried because he knew he didn't think the gas station would be this far away. He knew that he was in a little bit of a pickle here. So he did take a few more mouthfuls of the windshield wiper fluid. He probably got through about a third of his water bottle's worth. Again, just doing very slow sips, just being very careful, again, to try and not make himself throw up in all of this. Now, unfortunately, the sun did go down, and he thought about continuing on since, you know, it'd be easier to work when it was cooler, but it also made it so that he really couldn't tell where he was going at all. So he didn't really want to risk getting into, you know, a hole in the ground, or, you know, running into something, or getting completely off course. So in the end, he decided that he just needed to sleep out the night, which he wasn't super thrilled about the idea of sleeping out the night again out in the desert, especially now that he wasn't around his car. But he had walked so far, you know, there really wasn't much of a choice at this point. So he kept going as long as he could, as long as there was sunshine, but eventually getting to a point where he just decided that he had to go ahead and sleep for the night. Whoops. So now it was his first night out in the desert. He really was boy, this is going to be a tricky lava spot. It was his first night out in the desert, and, you know, he slept as best as he could. He knew he had to try and get some strength back, but you know, just really couldn't be very restful with how everything was. So he might have to call this one a dead end. So he did do his best to sleep through the night, and eventually did get a couple of hours of sleep in. He tried not to drink any more of the windshield wiper fluid throughout the night, you know, knowing again he might need to conserve it while going off and continuing to walk through the desert. And again, just really wanting to be sure that it didn't cause him issues. You know, he had, like I said, about a third of it, and so he didn't want that to, you know, maybe it was more of a cumulative, too much in your system causing you to throw up or something. So he decided to be careful. So the sun started to come up again then the next day. He must have fallen asleep more than he had realized, been able to doze off, or drift off a little bit better, because he was awoken by the sun coming up. And so he you know, again, he kind of pointed himself off in the direction. He could tell, though, that things are getting pretty off at this point. Something felt just a little bit wrong. He wasn't quite sure what all it was, you know, but knew that there was quite a few accumulating factors going on throughout his day in the desert the day before. So he started going off and could definitely, especially as he started moving more, could tell that things were starting to get not so great. Now this would be a give or take his second day without water, but you know, it was really kind of hard to tell if this counted as day 3 or not, since he had had such limited water before. He tried, following the sun again, but was feeling less and less confident about where he was in position to the gas station. So he kind of looked around and noticed a taller dune. So he decided to climb that and try and re-look around, see if he could see the gas station or the road somewhere. Maybe if nothing else, a familiar landmark. So he did go off and try to climb up that dune, and boy, he could tell it was really starting to affect him. It was early in the morning yet, and he was already grabbing for the water bottle of the wiper fluid. It was just really starting to get hard to go up this big dune here. But he kept going. He kept making his way up, doing the best that he could, and finally he did get to the top. And he was feeling pretty dizzy by this point. His vision every now and again would get a little soft around the edges. And he looked out around the top of the dune, and really wasn't seeing a lot that looked like it could be the gas station or the road. But he did see what kind of looked like maybe a group of dunes that he had been drifting around at the very start of the time he went out the day before. So he thought he must have been on the right track. It looked like he was a little bit off if he would keep going in the straight line he had started out in. But he thought as long as he kind of headed towards that grouping of dunes, that he would eventually make his way to where the gas station or the road or something must have been. So he kept on his way, kept going down. Going down the dune was really a lot easier, but he could tell it was still pretty difficult for the level of strength that he had. And as he kept going out then on the flats off towards where he thought that group of other dunes was, he was really just feeling the stress of the day. Again, was reaching for that bottle of the wiper fluid quite a few more times, and each time he did try and conserve it as best as he could. Just doing small mouthfuls, just letting it kind of drift down his mouth without doing big gulps or big swallows or anything. So he eventually, it was probably about the middle of the day now, and he was really feeling the heat of the sun this day, especially since it had been so long since he'd had real water. And he got to the dunes, and boy, he was really feeling sick. Bill was not doing good. His vision was getting dark around the edges a little bit. His mouth was always dry. About this point was when he finished off the last of the windshield wiper fluid. So he'd gone through about a whole liter's worth was the bottle he had. It just kind of got to the point where he knew that he was getting to his limits here. But he had made it to those dunes, so he was sure that if he could just get past them, that the gas station must be on the other side. So that kind of gave him an extra boost of strength, an extra boost of motivation to keep going. But he knew it was going to be harder too, because it was going to be the rough dunes. It wasn't going to just be flat ground to be traveling on anymore. But he kept going. He kept climbing up, doing the best that he could. And it was making... Well, he wasn't making good time. There really was no way to sugarcoat it. He was doing pretty rough at this point. But he got up to the top of the one dune and thought, maybe, just maybe, he would see the gas station off in the distance or something. But he didn't see anything. It was now, really kind of squarely in the middle of the day. The sun was hitting him at the hottest. And he kept repeating to himself, the rule of 3, he's got to beat the rule of 3. But in the back of his mind, he knew that, he'd probably shortchanged it a little bit, being out in the desert, doing all this work of hiking. And, he just knew that he probably wasn't this was probably his last day, you know, even though it had been more like 2.5. This was probably the end of it. But he just knew that if he could get over the dunes, he could get back to the gas station, and you know everything would be fine then. So he didn't really see anything too striking from the top of the one dune, but he knew that it had been kind of a group of them that he'd come across, so he figured he'd go to the top of the next dune, and whatever landmark he could see from the top of that one is what he would go off of. So he made his way down. He more or less just kind of let himself roll down this dune. He really didn't have the energy to keep hiking along it. And just kind of tumbled on down. And at this point, you know, it was getting hard to even keep walking. He was really reaching the limits of his energy. He knew he was getting to kind of an end point here. So he did his best to keep struggling towards the next dune. But it was really, he got about halfway up before he just kind of, his legs finally gave out. And he knew that wasn't great. But he still had some strength. He still had the motivation of knowing, if I can just get to the top of this dune, find a landmark, make out for it, it'll all be fine. So at this point, he was, you know, just crawling along. He could tell his breath was getting more difficult. You know, his vision was getting even more shaky along the edges and things. But he did manage to get to the top of the dune. And, you know, he couldn't see that well anymore at this point. But he could see off in the distance, kind of towards the bottom of the dune, a shadow. And he didn't know if it was the gas station or if it was, you know, some water or somebody's RV or camper. He really had no idea. But he knew that it was a landmark and it was the best shot he had. So he was obviously overjoyed to be able to see something that wasn't just sand. So he made out for it. He did the best he could. He headed out towards that shape. Again, he just kind of more or less rolled down this dune. And when he got to the bottom, he knew that this was kind of the last push he was going to have. He would have the energy, hopefully, to make it to whatever that landmark was. But otherwise, that was going to be kind of the extent of it. So he was crawling along, and, you know, he was just barely getting that last bit of motivation. The sun was just about going down at this point, which was definitely welcome. It was kind of giving him that last little bit of energy. He at the very least, wasn't having his strength sapped anymore as strongly as it had when the sun was up in full. But he just kind of kept on making his way. You know, and finally he was getting to a point, you know, where his vision essentially was completely black. And he knew that wasn't a good sign. He didn't know a whole lot about, you know, medicine or anything, but he knew that if your vision basically goes out, that's not a good sign when it comes to anything, really. And, you know, the feeling of the sand against his hands as he was crawling, you know, just, it had been a long, kind of painful, you know, coarseness the whole time he was going, but it was starting to get where it was feeling numb. And he knew, too, that either was just a sign that he'd gotten very used to it, or much more likely that he just wasn't having the sensation anymore. So it was getting to be pretty rough situation. But he could just barely make off in the distance with the last little glimpses of his vision. He could make off whatever that shadow was that he had seen. And he was glad that the shadow hadn't vanished. Part of him had been worried that it had been, you know, a mirage off in the distance or something. But sure enough, here it was. It must have been something, because he could still just barely make it out with what vision he had left. So Bill, he just kept on going. He kept trekking over to it. He used up the last ounces of his strength and finally reached this kind of dark shadow. Now, by this point, he essentially couldn't see. Both his vision was going, and, you know, the sun had gone down enough that it just really wasn't where you could see very well in the desert anyways. And and he knew that he was kind of at the limit. So whatever it was that was here, it had to be what got him through. So he reached for it. He kept climbing towards it, and it felt smooth. It felt like it could maybe have been some asphalt, or like a parking lot, or maybe the road. It had to be something. It felt too smooth to be like just a rock out in the desert or something. But he really wasn't sure where he was. He was just hoping against hope that he had made it to the gas station parking lot or something, and that someone would come and find him. Because frankly, at this point, he really didn't even have the strength to keep going. He just kind of got to the edge of it and more or less collapsed at that point. And Bill knew at this point that it was kind of completely at the mercy of, whoever else would come by. He could feel his strength going. He could feel his breath just being completely difficult. His mouth was sore, but he could feel too he was starting to go numb. Things just weren't as painful anymore at this point. And so he knew that this was kind of his last hope of someone had to either come and rescue him, or he was just going to die wherever it was that he had landed. Now he doesn't know how long it was, but finally he did hear, or thought he heard a voice. And, all of his senses were kind of going numb. Everything was getting more difficult. So he wasn't sure if he truly heard it, but he thought he heard someone say hello. It sounded very muffled, but he rasped out as best as he could, and really, he could tell that he really didn't make much of a noise when he rasped out, just kind of a muffled hello. But as he did it, the voice came louder and clearer back, and he could hear, "Hello, are you okay?" And this time he was certain he must have heard somebody. So he mustered up the kind of the last of his strength, and replied back, please help me. And the voice didn't respond back right away. He didn't know if he had made it up in the end, or if he just couldn't hear anymore. And finally, the voice kind of came over and said, well, how can I help you? And kind of with that last effort, that last kind of sense of relief, Bill just said, please, whatever. I'm just so thirsty. I don't want to be thirsty anymore. And with that, he kind of used up the last of his strength. He could feel himself blacking out. But he heard back, certainly. He wasn't quite sure what that meant, but he ended up blacking out right then and there. Now he woke up a few moments ago, or a few moments later, and he could tell things were different. For one, his hand hurt like crazy. He wasn't sure if maybe since it had gone numb earlier, if he had sliced up against a rock or what, but his hand was really, really painful. But the other thing he noticed was that he wasn't as thirsty anymore, which was obviously of great relief. He started kind of looking around, trying to get his senses more about him, and just kind of kept glancing about. Slowly his vision kept coming back more and more. And he could tell things were getting better. His throat didn't hurt anymore. His vision kept improving. His hands still just hurt like crazy, but he was doing much better. So he continued to try and get his wits about him, when suddenly he heard the voice from earlier. And, could hear the voice said, "Oh, good. I was getting a little worried there. You weren't popping back right away, but it seems like that did the trick." Now Bill was still kind of trying to orient himself, and of course he was in the desert at night. It was difficult to see as it was, but he he looked around and said, "Yes, thank you. I'm feeling much better. I've got a few scrapes and bruises, especially my hand. I'm not sure if I cut it or what, but I am feeling generally much better, and thankfully I'm not feeling thirsty anymore." And the voice just kind of replied back, "Well, good. I mean, that is what you wished for, was to not be so thirsty anymore." And Bill was a little bit confused by that statement, but was able to at least use it to pinpoint where the voice was coming from. And he looked over expecting to see, somebody, but couldn't find anyone at eye level, and he was looking around. He's like, "Yes, thank you. Where are you?" And he heard the voice say, "Oh, well, I'm down here." And so Bill looked down, not sure why whoever helped him would be down on the ground. And where he looked, where he heard the voice, he saw a enormous snake. It was difficult to tell in the desert for sure, in the dark, but he could make out the long, slender body of just this enormous snake, larger than any he'd ever seen before in pictures or movies. It probably in like a nature documentary, like an anaconda or something. But you could never tell the shape, and obviously never something he had seen himself. And so he just froze. Obviously he had been in a hard spot of crawling through the desert, being in all of this peril, but now here he was, finally revived, and he was about to be eaten by a snake. And then suddenly he heard from this direction of the snake the voice again say, "Yes, well, I suppose I do get that a lot when people first meet me. But it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance." And at this point, Bill assumed he had died. Because how else could a snake be talking to him? But it definitely was indeed the voice that he had been hearing, the voice that had helped him out, was coming from this snake. He didn't know if he perhaps was even hallucinating as a final step of dying, but he knew that snakes don't talk. This couldn't be possible. So he decided to just go along with it, because if he was dying, he may as well just stick along with the whole routine. So he replied back to the snake, "Well, yes, I suppose you are a bit surprising, but that's what happens, I suppose, when you're out in the desert and don't drink water for several days." And the snake just kind of replied back and was like, "Well, I suppose it probably doesn't happen very often. As far as I know, there's just the me, but yeah, I guess I haven't been around everywhere. You never know, this could be a common occurrence after all." And Bill just kind of looked back and replied to the snake, "Well, yeah, it's not, I would say, a common occurrence, but, I guess not unsurprising when you're dying of dehydration and hallucinating on your way out." And the snake just kind of looked at him, kind of on a head tilted look, which Bill assumed was it looking at him curiously, and just replied back, "Well, no, you're not dying anymore. I helped you out." And Bill, obviously confused, just kind of replies back, "Well, how did you help me?" "Oh, well, you see, I gave you the first bite." And Bill just looked back confused, and, "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, I bit you on the hand. I'm sure it still hurts. But see, you had wished to not be thirsty anymore. So since you'd made a request, I gave you the first bite." And Bill just kind of looked down and realized that indeed in his hand were two what looked like probably puncture wounds from what could be very long teeth, especially what you would expect coming from a snake. And started to dawn on him why his hand hurt. Well, it was because the snake had bit him. Obviously, he was still all very confused by all of this, but he knew several things. He had been very thirsty, and he had been for sure what he was sure was on the brink of dying. But now he was talking to a snake and wasn't thirsty anymore, and the snake claims it's because the snake had bitten him. So again, really not knowing at this point what to believe and what to accept as reality, he decided to just go along with it. "Okay, I see, said Bill. So I guess you gave me the first bite, and now I'm not thirsty anymore. Well, thanks for that. Well, you're welcome, replied the snake. Well, I guess that's all pretty nice. Can I just go, or, were you wanting to just stop and chat, or, what do I do next, I suppose? And the snake just kind of, again, gave that sideways look, and looked at him curiously and said, well, I suppose you could leave. I've only given you the first bite, so that's completely allowed. But I would like to point out that I think you're still dying. At which point, Bill kind of felt shocked and said, well, but I'm not thirsty anymore, and, I was dying of thirst, so, that must take care of things. Well, yes, I took care of you being thirsty, but, I think you're still poisoned. And, Bill obviously jumped at things. He's like, oh, well, if your bite was just going to poison me. And the snake instantly stopped and replied, no, 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 no. See, the bite doesn't poison you, but I think whatever you had been drinking before is what poisoned you. And at this point, Bill remembered the windshield wiper fluid. And he said, well, sure, I was drinking some wiper fluid, but I don't think that poisoned me. And the snake said, well, that would explain why I thought I smelled methanol on your breath. And Bill just kind of stopped and said, what? Oh, yes. See, I could smell what I thought was methanol on your breath. And you said that you drank some windshield wiper fluid. So that would make sense. I'm pretty sure if I remember what Samson told me was that some windshield wiper fluid has methanol in it. And methanol can be poisonous. Well, I thought they just put stuff in it to make you sick so that people wouldn't drink it. Well, yes, they probably do that too, but, obviously they don't want you to drink things that can poison you. So I all I know for sure, though, is that I smell methanol on your breath, and I would kind of assume, based on the size of the water bottle that you have, that you probably drank enough where you're probably still dying. So obviously Bill was pretty distraught by this new news. He thought he had been drinking the windshield wiper fluid to protect him, but if it was actually poisoning him, well, that obviously wasn't very good. So Bill, was clearly distraught here and just kind of said, well, what do I do next? Well, I could give you the second bite, which you could use to wish for something to not be poisoned anymore, or some other way around it. But with that come rules. And essentially at this point, Bill, really didn't care. So he's like, well, whatever rules you have, whatever it takes, I'm pretty open to it. And the snake just kind of looked back and said, okay, I mean, that makes sense. If I were in your situation, I wouldn't want to be poisoned either. But I feel like you should just kind of know that there are rules that you'll have to follow, including the rule of secrecy, if I give you the second bite. But considering the position you're in, I guess I don't really see much of a choice. And Bill said, yeah, I suppose not really. I am obviously in quite the predicament here, so I guess we're just going to have to move along with this. So what, do I just wish I'm not poisoned and that takes care of it? Well, I mean, that's one thing you could do, replied the snake. But obviously, too, then I have to give you another bite. Oh, another bite? My hand still hurts like crazy from the first one. Of course, I guess that's better than, dying of poison. Yes, I suppose it would be. So, do I just say I wish I'm not poisoned anymore? Well, hang on now. As much as I, wouldn't mind just granting that wish, you do only get a handful of wishes in general, through the bites. So you do need to kind of think through. I can't just hand out infinite numbers of bites to everybody, obviously. So you might want to think through, maybe a better way to be doing this. Okay, do you have some suggestions? Well, I suppose something you could do that would be more generally useful would to also wish that you were just always in good health. I think that that would kind of take care of things like the methanol poisoning. And also, you've been walking around in the desert for a long time. So eventually, the other effects of being out in the desert are going to catch up on you. I assume you haven't really been wearing sunscreen. You haven't had food. Whereas I feel if you wished for good health, that could provide other benefits too. Where you would be able to last longer without food and things like that. Yeah, that all makes sense and sounds pretty good, said Bill. Thanks. I guess then I wish for good health. And he held out his other hand. And the snake just kind of looked at him for a second and said, well, I could bite your hand, but I feel like you might be pulling away a lot. It seems like that's the usual reaction after a human gets bit once, is that they really try to avoid getting bit again. He's like, yeah, well, I mean, that may be true, but if you don't, then obviously I'm going to die of the poisoning, so I don't want that to happen. Well, yes, but I've been around a lot of humans before. Well, not a lot, but my fair share, and I feel like I know enough about their behavior where you'd either pull away or maybe kick at me or do something just kind of out of reflex of knowing that I'm coming to bite you again. Well, by all means, that may be so, but I'm kind of in a pickle here, so, maybe just kind of hurry up here, if you do get swatted or something out of reflex, like, obviously I'm sorry, but I'm in kind of a time crunch, I'm getting poisoned here, and Bill was obviously getting very, very concerned, kind of starting to panic a little bit. He didn't know how long he had till the poison would start to really cause some other issues and effects. And of course, as he was kind of going about his rant here, he didn't notice that the snake was making its way around him, kind of slithering off to the side, until finally he was able to get where he was in a good position, and he quick lunged out and bit him right on the butt. Which obviously caused Bill to jump quite a bit, and the snake just kind of laughed in a snaky type laugh and chuckled, "Haha, gotcha." And Bill turned around, hey, that wasn't nice. I wasn't prepared for that. Yeah, but isn't that better to have it kind of been more of a surprise? Now you won't be quite so jumpy, and it's over with. You don't have to worry about it anymore. Plus, I'd imagine having the wish have been that you were generally in good health, that you should start feeling better pretty soon from both bites now. Which, Bill was kind of mad about all of this, but couldn't argue against it, and indeed could tell that his hand was feeling a little bit better, and, the bite on his backside was obviously much fresher, but already didn't feel quite as painful as the first bite had been. So begrudgingly, he didn't really say anything, but he decided that the snake was right. Well, thanks. So I guess now I've had the vow of secrecy, or the pledge of secrecy, or however it was that you said. Yes, the rule of secrecy. So now that you've received 2 bites, you are now not able to tell anyone about this place. Oh, said Bill. I mean, a snake that grants wishes, that seems something pretty incredible. Wouldn't you want lots and lots of people to know? Well, yes, I mean, for one thing, it could provide a lot of benefit, but, who knows what kind of wishes some people would make. It's kind of a difficult thing to just allow anyone to make wishes. Generally a stray passerby is going to be just fine, but if people really got to know about this, then, they might start monopolizing it, and some truly wicked people may try coming out here for wishes. Not to mention that it would get really exhausting for me to have to be biting people all day and granting wishes. Yeah, I guess I suppose that all makes sense. And at this point, Bill's hand was really starting to feel better. His backside was feeling better. And he could tell that just kind of everything else, his vision was overall better. His numbness was more or less gone at this point. Things were really doing considerably better. So well, he maybe wasn't too happy about getting bitten by surprise and now being unable to tell anyone about this place. He couldn't be too mad considering all of the benefits he'd received. Well, so now that I've had these 2 bites, is there anything else that I'm supposed to do or can't do? Well, now that you've received 2 bites and you are vowed to the rule of secrecy, I can also now share knowledge with you. That's one of the benefits of secrecy in the second bite is I can tell you things that I maybe couldn't have told you before. Oh, yeah, I mean, that does seem pretty interesting. Obviously, a snake that can talk and can bite people and grant wishes seems like they would probably have a lot of things that they would know and be able to tell. Yeah, that does make sense. So I guess first off, where am I? And as he said that, he kind of started first taking his glances around the area that he was at, noticing in better detail the shadows of the target he had been looking for. And he realized that it was more or less a big, smooth stone of some sort, but it was the strangest stone that he had ever seen. It was completely smooth, and it spanned out quite a ways, and it looked like it was man-made, but with how just the way of it, but it also looked very old, so he didn't know who could have made it so long ago. He noticed too that with the second bite, he now had better vision in things, so he was able to see in the darkness better, and he noticed off in the very center of the dark circle there was a what looked like a pole, and this pole it was at kind of a strange angle, more or less a 45-degree angle, and it was right in the very center of this circular area, and with it there was kind of looked like a little spot that it was resting in, and it give or take, it was sticking out where it was about 4 feet high. It was probably taller than that because things at an angle, when it's laid down, it's always taller. But he was very curious by it. He started to walk towards it, and the snake just kind of said, "Oh, well, I see you've noticed the lever, which I would caution you to not really get much closer to." And Bill just kind of stopped and was like, "Oh, and well, why is that?" "Oh, well, you see, it's kind of a important lever. See if right now it's in the on position. Well, I assume it's an on position. I suppose it could be in an off position, but it's in this direction. But see, if you were to push that so that it went off in the other direction, well, then that would stop." "Oh, and so what would stop if I switched it?" "Oh, humanity." And Bill just kind of stopped. He wasn't sure if he had heard things right. He was very confused by this, and was just like, I'm sorry, what was that?" "Yes, see, anyone who's received the bite, if they push that lever, then it stops humanity." And Bill was just sat there dumbfounded. He's like, "Well, you think you maybe could have told me that before you bit me in the first place. That's a lot of pressure." And he continued to back away from the lever, getting away from it, and the snake just kind of stopped and, "Oh yes, well, considering you were dying and all, there wasn't a whole lot of time to go into the details there." And Bill just kind of paused and thought about it for a second. He's like, "Yeah, I suppose not, but what's something like that just doing sitting out here? Couldn't anything stumble across it and knock it?" Well, no, like I said, you have to first be bitten. It can't just be any stray, person or animal, or weather event. It has to specifically be someone who has received a bite. Boy, that's a lot of pressure, but I suppose it's good that it's just in this one location. Is there anything else like that I should be cautious of around here? "Oh, no, that's the only thing." Oh, well, that's good. That I would hate to accidentally step on, say, a button that stops the air from existing or something like that. Oh yes, no, nothing like that. Just that. Just the lever in the metal there. Okay, well I'm going to back away and keep my distance. Yeah, that seems like a good idea. Um, so Bill continued to look around and looked at it. So where did this circle stone thing come from? And how does something like that exist? I mean, you exist, you're a talking snake, so I suppose that's one thing, but hey, do you have a name, by the way? Oh, yes, it's Nate. Really? Nate. That's quite a modern name for a snake. Yes, see, Samson gave it to me. Samson? Oh, yes, he was another one who had received the bite before you. He had been here for a while, and he did a lot of things. We spent a lot of time together, and one of the things is that he gave me a name. See, before that, I was just called a snake, or the snake, or not called anything at all. Because, there's not a lot out here in the desert. I suppose so. Well, Nate, replied Bill. So what else is all of this? Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure about all of that. See, the stone and the lever and, all of this was here before I was. It had all been here back when the bigger snake had been here, before the bigger snake left me here to be in charge of it. And so I didn't really know where it came from or how long it had been here before I came. All I really know is how it works. I see. Well, and how long then have you been here? Oh, see, I'm not really sure of that either. I hadn't thought to really keep track of time, or the days or any of that. And really until the first people came by, and found me for the first time, I didn't really even have a concept of, what the days and the years necessarily were. So I really didn't keep track of time until, maybe a couple hundred years ago. Oh, well, you look pretty good for being a couple hundred years old. Thanks. I am, a talking, wish-granting snake after all, so I would hope I would look pretty good. Yeah, again, I suppose that's fair. And he could kind of see, it was hard to tell for sure in the dark and on the features of a snake, but he thought Nate was maybe smiling, kind of laughing at the little bit of a joke he'd made there. So he continued, Bill continued walking around the circle and looking at things, and was like, so, I don't know, I guess, how do all these wishes work? You said there were a limited number of bites. Is it just the two? Oh no, there's actually a third bite you can receive as well. But with that comes the great responsibility, the rule of the responsibility. So the first bite is free, the second bite has the rule of secrecy, and then the third bite has the rule of responsibility. And then that's the end of the bites that you can receive. I see. So out of curiosity, I assume that the third bite still comes with a wish? Oh yes, of course, each bite comes with a wish. And what is the rule of responsibility? Well, the rule of responsibility is that you must vow that if you ever deem that it's time for humanity to end, that you come and flip the switch, or flip the lever. Wow, that's quite a responsibility, thought Bill. I can't imagine why anyone would ever take that. It's one thing to have it where, if I accidentally would push it, that would stop, but to be in charge of needing to come and do it if I think that humanity deserves to end, I can't imagine anyone would ever want that. Yes, well, generally people wouldn't. Generally people get the first bite, maybe the second. Actually, usually people get the second bite because they like the idea of two wishes. But usually people don't want the third bite. Samson did take it, though. Really? That's quite the responsibility. And that must be why he ended up ended up spending so much time with you, since he had made such a big decision. Oh, yes. See, it was very difficult for him to decide whether or not to take the third bite. But once he did say he was glad he did, for the wish that it was able to grant him. I see, and I guess what wish did Samson wish for with the third bite? He wished for wisdom. That makes sense. That seems like a good wish if you're going to be in charge of such a big responsibility. Yes, it's generally one that I would probably recommend should anyone else ever decide that they want the third bite as well. Samson seemed to like it, and it just, considering the graveness of the responsibility of taking the third bite, it's one I would definitely encourage at the very least. Well, boy, I guess that's a tough decision, because obviously I don't want that responsibility, but wisdom is a very, well, a wise idea for a wish. Tell me a little bit more about Samson. What else did he do? Well, he came here along and, was in not quite as rough of a state as you, but a similar state, and kind of used his first two wishes in a similar manner. The second wish was the same as his second wish of staying in generally good health. That's kind of where I got the idea for it. And it actually ended up giving Samson the gift of extended life as well. As it turns out, not getting sick and not having other issues, and probably just the extent of the wish itself gives you the ability to just have a far extended life. So we spent many years together, quite a while in fact. And again, Bill wasn't quite sure, but it was hard to tell the features on the snake. And he wasn't quite used to talking to a snake, considering Nate was the first snake he'd ever talked to. But he thought he could see maybe a little bit of a sadness in Nate's face as he kept talking about Samson. But yeah, Samson spent a long time here. We used to talk about lots of things. He introduced me to lots of ideas I hadn't really thought of before, and told me about all kinds of things out in the world. You see, part of my responsibility of being here is I'm not really supposed to leave the circle. I'm supposed to stay here and be able to provide the bites if necessary. Oh, I suppose you really liked having then someone from the outside who kept coming back and checking on you. Yes, Samson was a good friend. He was very good about always trying to teach me about things that he had seen and bringing back new stories. Well, and I take by the fact that I'm still here, Samson must have never have decided to flip the lever then. Oh, no, of course not. He had obviously had his times when he'd considered it and wondered about it. Various wars and different things that people did that were terrible to each other, but he always found good things too, and was able to kind of have different perspectives, having lived so long. He always said that the wisdom made it much easier too to weigh the different options. He did have a couple of times though when he would come here and stare at it and contemplate and even ask me about my thoughts on things, and ultimately though the decision is up to whoever receives the third bite. I see. Well, it's good to know that he never quite felt that it was time for this big switch there. Yep, it was. Well, what else about Samson? I mean, you talk about him fondly, but I guess is he still around? No. You see, that's I guess something that I can't tell you fully until you should receive the third bite. There's a few secrets that have to be withheld until that point, and I think that's one that you aren't able to hear about yet, unless you take the rule of obligation there. I see. And Bill just kind of stopped and thought for a while, and thought about it, and he knew that it was quite an undertaking. He wasn't sure that it would be good to have this responsibility, but at the same time, the wisdom, he could see the benefits of having wisdom, and especially with his long life that sounded like was ahead of him, he decided that finally, maybe he would. And so he just kind of smiled at Nate and said, well, I think you have another customer. Go ahead, I'll take the third bite. And he held out his unbitten hand. And Nate just kind of looked at him with kind of a smirking face and said, "We already tried that, and you didn't like that, or it didn't work out too well of you knowing about it was coming." And Bill just kind of smiled back and said, "Yeah, but I've had a couple of bites now. I know that the pain goes away, and I know the benefits of it. So go ahead. I won't pull away. You don't need to trick me this time. I'm good." And so Nate just kind of smiled back, started motioning like he was working his way around to Bill's backside, and kind of chuckled a little bit, and then finally came over to his hand and went ahead and bit him. Now, again, the bite hurt to begin with, but the pain Bill could already tell was passing quickly, and he also could tell that there was something different about him. He knew that there wasn't anything that had physically changed anymore. It wasn't like when he had stopped being thirsty or when he had been in good health, generally good health, but he could tell there was something different. And so he just kind of took it all in. He wasn't sure, what the differences were, but he just kind of took his time and observed. He could tell time was passing, but things did feel a little bit different, and the passage of time didn't seem to make as much of a difference. He kind of walked around the circle, tucked his feet into the sand just to feel the differences of that. And just kind of took it all in for a while. Finally, he looked over at Nate and smiled and said, "Well, that it's a grave responsibility you've given me here, Nate, but I feel like I'm equipped." "Well, good," said Nate. I'm glad that you can already sense a little bit of something different. So, if you don't mind telling me, I know it's a sensitive topic, but what's the secret you couldn't tell me about Samson?" "Well," said Nate, "you see, I had lied to begin with. Well, sort of lied. There is more than just the 3 bites." "Oh, really?" said Bill. "Yes, you see, there is a 4th bite, and that's why Samson isn't here anymore. See, the 4th bite is death. It doesn't grant wishes anymore. The only thing it provides is death. And obviously you have to receive the first 3 bites to get to that point. And it's the last secret that gets withheld. But should you ever decide, there is the 4th bite that you can receive, which would be death. And a number of years ago, Samson had come to me and decided he was ready for that. Like I said, he lived for quite a long time, and he had been married when he first met me. And I think that was ultimately what kind of led to the issues. When his wife died, he was pretty hurt by that for a while, and it took him a while to recover. But I think it was when his son died, when he outlived his son, was the point when he finally decided he had made it long enough. So it wasn't right away after that, but after a while he finally came and asked me for the 4th bite. "I see," said Bill, and kind of he knew it was a tender moment for Nate, and he didn't want to overstress it, and gave him some time to process things. "Well, it sounds like you had a good friend, though, and it's good that you had the time with him to be able to remember him and enjoy." Yes, it was good," said Nate. "I suppose you'll be sounding more and more like Samson now that you've received this bite. You certainly sound plenty like him as it is. In some ways, anyways. The wisdom, I think, tends to do that." "Yes, I would imagine it does," kind of chuckled Bill back at Nate. "So, I don't know, I suppose, tell me more about yourself. Tell me more about your wishes and your time here. I'd like to get to know you, Nate. You seem very interesting and nice. Oh well, thanks. I guess there's not a whole lot to tell. Like I said, I've been here, and ever since Big Snake left me, it's been my responsibility to kind of um, watch the circle here and be able to provide the bites. Yeah. So about the wishes, I guess. Do you have any idea how it is that they work? Well, not really, but there are some limitations. Obviously, you have to be bitten, and then there's the rules that go with for the rule of secrecy and the rule of obligation. So there's some limitations there, but also I can't just do anything. The wishes can't be used for, say, making you omnipotent. It has to be something that that a living body is able to handle. So being omnipotent, really wouldn't work. I suppose omnipresent, I could maybe turn you into a cloud or something. I don't know. That would be a little strange, but I suppose that would have been something I could have done. But otherwise, like the not being thirsty anymore. Well, I borrowed from like tortoises on that one, and tortoises are able to handle being out in the desert for long stretches, or like a desert hare. Yeah, sorry, a desert hare being able to survive out in the desert without water for long stretches versus like a tortoise, having very good health, having a slow metabolism. I kind of use those abilities for giving you the generally good health, and suspect that's part of why you live for so long. It's not like you now have bits of hare and tortoise in you and other animals. It's just it had to be something that other living creatures are able to do. There's also lots of animals that are immune to certain poisons and things like that. So kind of a mixture of those things, I think, is why I was able to grant your wishes. And as far as the wisdom, well, that's something that lots of animals are able to be born with. So it was just kind of enhancing what was already there. I see. That's really quite impressive. You're quite an astounding creature there, Nate. Well, thanks. And Bill is pretty sure you could see kind of a snaky smile going on now. So about this rule of obligation. So obviously, if I ever feel that humanity has kind of reached its point where it should no longer be, and I need to come here and pull out my obligation. I mean, is there a way for me to, I don't know, do it from a distance? Like, could I set up some sort of remote control or something? Oh yes, I know Samson had thought of that sort of idea before too, said Nate. And it's certainly a clever plan, but it seems like there's something strange about this circle in general, where things that aren't living aren't able to be left here. They won't disappear immediately, but they can't stay here. See, Samson had tried making like some sort of electronic arm that would be able to push the lever on its own from a distance with like a remote control, and he'd spent months planning it and spent an entire day putting it up. And he set it up and got it in position, but wasn't able to end up leaving it here because it eventually disappeared somehow. We aren't really sure, but after he left it in place, it just kind of eventually vanished. Wow, that's really strange. But so it is good to know though that it doesn't have to be like my hand touching it. It could be some sort of contraption or something. Oh yes, it's as long as you are in control of something that pushes it, then that will cause humanity to stop. I see. Boy, that's good to know too. With this new wisdom, perhaps there'd be something I'd be able to think of, but I guess I'll have to work on that and think about it for a while. Not that I have any issues with coming back here. I feel like I haven't known you long, Nate, but I feel like it would be good to continue to know you, and I don't mind coming and visiting. Well, that's good. I guess I didn't want to force you into it, but I was hoping that you wouldn't mind continuing to visit. It's obviously nobody is a replacement for Samson, but it is nice having some company again. It can go quite a long while before another person shows up for me to spend some time with. I suppose so, said Bill. Considering we are right out here in the middle of the desert and things are pretty hidden. Oh, yes, things are... That's kind of, I think, some of the intention, which, it hadn't always been a desert. It had once been a big, lush jungle, and it, of course, was quite hidden back then, but there is something where nobody ever seems to try to develop nearby it. So that's maybe some more of the mysteries of it that we just don't quite understand. I see, said Bill. Now, at this point, the night had passed and the sun was beginning to come up. And Bill kind of looked off in the distance and it's like, oh, I suppose the sun is coming up. I should probably head back to the gas station where I'd originally come from. I guess I don't suppose you know where it would go. Oh, yes. See, it's off in that direction. And he pointed more or less back in the direction where Bill had come from. It's straight out east, straight out west from here. Well, no, that's west where the sun is coming up. Oh, no. The sun rises in the east. It goes alphabetically. Oh, said Bill and kind of chuckled to himself. Well, I guess that explains why I wasn't making my way. Yes, no, I suppose not. But yeah, more or less, if you just head back in that direction, you should hit I believe there's a gas station off that way that Samson used to mention. It's probably still there if you're talking about it. So Bill set off and, thanked Nate again for everything that he had done and promised to return, and headed off more or less exactly back the way he had come. He did find that traveling off in the desert was significantly easier now. He wasn't thirsty anymore, and he found that the strain of the hiking was no longer physically as taxing, and was certain that it was because of the wishes that he'd received. In fact, by the end of the first day, he made it back to his Jeep where it had originally landed, and so he was already making significantly better time. The next day, then, he set off and made it back to the gas station, and was able to get his Jeep towed out to the desert. He was careful, though, to make sure that the tow truck didn't continue on past the area where his Jeep was. He knew that he had to keep Nate and the circle a secret now that he had received the second bite. So Bill continued off and headed on back more or less to his life. He had a small job where he had worked for years, and he continued at that for a time, but he found that just kind of a desk office job really wasn't fulfilling anymore now that he had this new wisdom. So he decided to go back to school and took courses, in lots of things that had always interested him, and philosophy, and found that he was quite good at it with the increased wisdom now. And eventually, ended up writing some books, and he started going by the name of William, finding that Bill was just a little too young for his new mantle that he had acquired. So William, over the years too, as he continued on with his schooling and his new life, always made sure to spend time to go back and visit Nate. He would go and visit for, days on end, weeks on end, really just spending whatever time felt right. And he was always careful to, bring things to help introduce him to things about the world. He would bring books and magazines and always try and bring any stories that he had. And he eventually, this was something that took a while for him to get up to, but he eventually got a computer that was, very specially made. It had satellite access to the internet, and it had special coverings to protect it from the sand. It had special functions so that Nate would be able to kind of use it with his tail, since he didn't, have fingers and things. And Nate was very pleased with this to receive. since it opened up a whole new world of possibilities with this new access and learnings that he'd be able to have. And throughout the time, William, like I said, had released some books and things, and actually started to get fairly wealthy. He upgraded his Jeep to an RV, and that made it a lot easier for going out and visiting Nate, which granted, because of the many dunes that had to be crossed, and just wanting to not accidentally leave any tracks showing where the way to Nate's circle was, he always made sure to not drive the RV out all the way to the circle. He would usually camp it close nearby to the gas station, and then hike out the rest of the way and tent it when he would visit Nate. So it continued on like this for a number of years, and every now and again, William would contemplate whether or not it had come time for him to fulfill his responsibilities of the third bite, but he always found reasonings why things weren't quite at that point. Now it was coming up to a time when William was getting ready to go on a big international book tour. He had a big release on a new book he'd published, and it was time for him to go off on a big signing tour, but he wanted to make sure he visited Nate one more time. And because of the computer and being able to talk over the internet, he was able to message him and do things, but he still always liked to visit face to face when possible. So he went out and did the normal routine of parking the RV and then hiking out with his tent, and got over to the area and said hello to Nate, as they always would do, and then Nate kind of had a different look on his face this time. Over the years, William had gotten quite used to the different faces of Nate, was quite used to the expressions that a snake gives off, especially a talking snake, and so could tell there was something a little bit of a funny look on his face. And so after they'd said hello and William kind of started to set up, Nate said, "I have someone to introduce you to." And William said, "Really? Yes. Sammy, come here." And kind of off from the distance, around the side of the circle, came a smaller snake. And William just kind of smiled at Nate and said, "Well, this is quite a surprise. Who's this little fella?" And Nate just kind of smiled back and said, "Well, this is my son. This is Sammy." And William kind of gave a knowing smile at Nate and said, "After Samson, I assume." And Nate kind of gave a sad smile back and just kind of nodded. And then William kind of, to try and lighten the mood, just kind of gave a knowing smile and said, "So how'd you go about getting a son snake here?" And Nate just kind of gave a big grin and said, "Well, there's still some secrets you're not entitled to." So for the visit, William had the extra surprise of having the new company of Sammy, who was a fun, energetic little kid. He also was a talking snake, as one would assume from being the son of another talking snake. And they had a nice visit, and William was able to kind of excitedly tell them about the upcoming journey he was going to have with the book signings, and just how fun it would be and to do the international travel, and how he obviously had wanted to spend this time, though, since it could be quite a while before he would be able to see Nate again. And so several days had passed, and they had had their visit, and it was time for William to get going. And as he was packing up, Nate kind of came to him and said, "Say, William, I have a request for you." And William said, "Oh, sure. What is it?" "I'd like you to bring Sammy along with you on your trip." "Oh," said William. "Well, won't you be lonely without him?" "Well, certainly, but it won't be for long, and I want Sammy to be able to go out and see the world, since I haven't been able to do that. I want him to get that chance, especially before it's his turn." And William just kind of stopped and said, His turn? Well, yes. See, I've decided, and, well, I'm ready to retire. I'm ready for the fourth bite. And William just completely stopped, just shocked and kind of dumbfounded, and, said, well, Nate, what do you mean? Well, you see, I've decided, and it's been a long time that I've been around, and I think I'm ready for the fourth bite for myself. It's been hard ever since Samson left, and don't get me wrong, William. You've been wonderful company, but it's been very difficult, and I've just decided it's time. And William, he obviously was hurt by this, but he could tell, having known Nate for so long, he could tell his mind was made up, and with his wisdom knew that it really wasn't worth pressing the matter anymore. So without really wanting to keep addressing it, he kind of moved along and said, well, so how does that work then? Do you bite yourself? Well, no, it doesn't quite work that way. See, I can't really give the fourth bite to myself. I'm going to need your help for that part. And at this, William kind of stopped in a cold sweat and was afraid to ask, but knew he had to, and simply said, well, Nate, what do you mean? And Nate kind of replied back, well, I can't give myself the fourth bite, and I can't leave this place. So I would like you to give me the fourth bite. Well, what do you mean? How would I go about doing that? Well, obviously I know that your bites aren't those of a magical snake. But I just more or less need you to kill me. And, William was obviously hurt by this realization that he was being asked to do this by his friend, and said, well, how exactly do you want that to happen? Well, see, I've actually researched it a little bit, not in great detail and not on a constant basis, but I've decided that I'd like to be decapitated, probably with a sword. I feel like that would be the fastest, quickest way. I've seen some videos of, a snake being shot or torn apart or run over, and those really don't seem like methods that I would like to go. But I feel like a sword would be very quick. So that's my request for you. I'd like you to bring Sammy out to see the world. Let him see the things that I was never able to. And then I'd like you to come back and give me the fourth bite. Well, does Sammy know about all of this? Yes, he does. We've spoken about it to great extent. And he's well aware of, what his responsibilities will be with staying at the circle once it's his turn of giving out the bites. And he knows that I'll receive the fourth bite for it to happen. But we've spent a long time talking about it, and so he's well aware and well equipped. Well, I suppose if you two are set on this, I guess I can't really say no. And Nate just kind of smiled back and said, I knew you would understand, William. Well, I suppose with that, it's time for you to head on your way. And William suddenly felt like there were things he had wished he had done or said differently during the visit. If only he had known. But he also, with his wisdom, knew that if he had known, that it would have changed, and they wouldn't have probably been able to enjoy the visit as authentically. So he saw some of the wisdom that Nate had as well in keeping it a secret until this point. So he called Sammy over, and Sammy had his little snake bag ready to go, and they headed off on their way back to William's RV, and went off and began their tour. So the tour started out, in the United States, and they spent a long time going around and seeing the different sites, visiting all the states, and hitting all the sites they're able to see throughout the span of the book tour. William obviously had sites that he had to get to and a schedule to keep, but they were able to do lots of sightseeing along the way. And it worked out pretty easily since they were able to just ride around in William's RV, It made it a lot harder, or a lot easier to bring a snake along with, and Sammy was smart enough to know to not be talking when other people were around, to not be surprising them. But after a while, it came time where they were going to go international then for the rest of the signings and tour. And that got a little bit trickier. They did manage to get Sammy onto all of the flights without issue, but there were a couple of times when they almost got caught. It being, as you would expect, fairly difficult to hide a snake going through all the transports, but Sammy was smart and William had his wisdom, so they were able to pull it off. So they traveled, more or less across the world, and William tried to really give Sammy sights and views and experiences of everything that he could think of. They went and saw mountains and went scuba diving, saw depths of the ocean. They were in hot climates and cold climates and wet climates and around lots of people and around no people, and Sammy just soaked it all in. It was all quite the experience for him, and his youth and enthusiasm obviously helped with it being quite the time. But eventually the book tour ended, and William knew that it was going to be time to go back. He did try to stretch things out a little bit as long as he could. He really didn't want to go back to Nate and fulfill his obligation, but he tried to keep giving excuses of, oh, well, we have to go see this site, and you don't want to miss this attraction. But eventually Sammy kind of knew what he was up to and pushed him along to, it was time to head back. Which then, of course, since Nate had requested the use of a sword, William was able to delay things a little bit longer with first saying he had to make sure he got a good sword, wanting to make sure that it was able to work the first time, and then got the idea that he needed to train how to use the sword so that he could make sure to get Nate in one sweep rather than doing a halfway cut or anything like that. And so he was able to delay things for a while longer, using that as an excuse. But eventually, the time came where he more or less mastered sword use. He had an excellent sword ready to go and really just couldn't push things off any longer. So William and Sammy, they knew the depth of what they were about to embark on. They geared back up and headed back, making their way towards, again, the deserts where Nate and the circle lived. And they just kind of, they headed back. They got in William's RV, making kind of the trek that William had done hundreds of times by this point, and all too familiar roads, but now it all felt very different, obviously, because it was a very different circumstance that they were going back with. And so they continued on. They eventually made it to the old gas station where William had been so many years ago, and that he continued to use as his stopping point. And eventually they headed out. However, unfortunately, William had made maybe not the best travel plans. He had been, obviously trying to delay everything for so long, and it was getting late and dark. And so it was the contemplation of, if they either stop, or if they continued on through the night. And, William just, he was getting so restless. He knew that if he spent a night in the desert here without making it back, that he'd just never be able to bring himself to head to the circle. So he knew that they had to press on. But because it was getting so late and so dark, he decided that he was going to risk it and just drive the RV out through the dunes, and out to the circle where Nate was, because he knew he had to get there tonight. If he didn't get there now, he would never be able to go through with it. And he figured he'd be able to go back then when he was on foot again and cover up the tire tracks. It would be a long process, but it would be worth it for not having to delay things any longer now that he was here. So he got kept driving out in the sand. The RV, it swished and swayed a little bit in the sand. It wasn't necessarily designed to be out in the sand like his Jeep was. It was a very solid RV. It could do some off-roading, but every now and again it would get a little slippery in the sand where it would sway and shake. However, William had it for a number of years and was very good at steering it and kind of knew how to work it, how to keep the tires going the direction he wanted. The trick came, though, when they came up to the dunes, the all too familiar dunes. The very first dune that they had to go up with in the RV, it handled okay. It got up the dune all right, but it was definitely a little precarious going down again on the dune. The RV really slipped and slid more than William would have liked, but he had made it this far and the sun was really going down, and he knew he just had to keep pressing on. So he went for an even taller dune. He knew it probably wasn't the best idea, but it would mean that he would have a shorter path. He wouldn't have to drive as much anymore, and he'd be able to just kind of keep going. So he went up and up and up, and somehow with kind of that steady pace, he was able to get up that dune. And at the very top of the dune, he could see below the circle. So he started, bringing the RV around, making his way down, keeping things, nice and steady. But suddenly, as he crested the top of the dune, the RV started to really sway and slip. And it really got to be where you could tell that things were just shaking. And it wasn't very long before William knew that he had more or less lost control with the RV here. And as he was kind of wrestling with control, he looked out and he realized he was on a direct path to the lever. And the words that Nate had spoken to him so many years ago suddenly rang out in his ears of how even if he pressed it, even if it wasn't with his hands, but was something that he was in control of, that would end humanity. And it dawned on him that he was on a direct collision course to run right into the lever, and it would end up switching it over. So William, he scrambled. He knew that this was a very dire situation. He didn't believe humanity deserved to end yet. He thought that there was still a chance and a hope for humanity. So he knew he had to get out of the way. And looking at the circle, he realized that he would be able to, if he could just land on the edge just right, he knew that he'd be able to swerve the RV just out of the way, kind of skipping it over things so that it would avoid the lever. Now, he began to turn the wheel and prepare himself to be able to do this. And he kind of set his sights on the spot, the one and only spot that he knew would be able to succeed. And, all this time, Rick sliding down the dune, getting closer and closer and faster. And suddenly he saw what he assumed must have been sleeping on the stone. Right there was Nate. And wouldn't you know that Nate was right there, right on the spot where he was heading towards. And suddenly it all seemed to suddenly go into slow motion right there. And William, he was processing and churning, and he realized he was on a direct collision course now that he had changed his path for where Nate was. And he kind of had that split-second decision of he could either get out of the way and avoid Nate, but then that would end humanity. And it was probably about the same time, at kind of an exact instant, where he could sense that Sammy had come to that same conclusion. And Sammy and William, again, kind of stared right at each other, and they almost simultaneously, having come to the same conclusion, realized and said to each other at the same time, "Better Nate than Lever."